My name is Adam Edmonsond, Master of Scotch, and I serve as the Head of Education and Examination at the Council of Whisky Masters. Today I'm here to share a few thoughts about tasting whiskey, in particular from the perspective of someone preparing for the blind tasting exams of the Council of Whisky Masters. As someone who's gone through the exams, I have many thoughts to share about how to prepare, as well as thoughts that will be interesting and useful for those who just want to learn how to appreciate whiskey more fully. For a broader step-by-step introduction for how to taste, evaluate, and appreciate a whiskey, I refer you to another video on this channel by Master of the Quake Charles MacLean, Systematic Whiskey Appreciation. My specific comments today will focus mainly within the domain of my own expertise, which is Scotch whiskey, but the way of thinking about the problem and the level of detail will apply equally to any other style of whiskey, whether you plan to take the Master of Bourbon exam or to go on to the Master of Whiskey exam. I hope that you'll find the comments sufficiently broad as to be useful for your own studies. Blind tasting as a topic is a bit controversial in whiskey. It can be difficult to imagine that even an expert taster can be expected to identify a whiskey down to the age, the bottling, the region, just on the basis of smell, taste, and appearance. That's true, it is very difficult and can be impossible due to the overlap in flavor between different whiskeys. The reason for tasting blind is not simply to learn how to perform an interesting trick at parties. The purpose of tasting blind is to eliminate the possibility of bias. No matter how hard you try not to be biased by knowledge in describing a whiskey, if you have a whiskey at hand, you know what it is, you will find yourself looking specifically for things that you expect based on your textbook knowledge, based on things you've heard about the whiskey, and you may find that you're influenced to find and describe things that go well beyond what's actually being delivered to your senses of sight, taste, and smell. In evaluating your mastery of the subject matter, it's important to the judges and to the council to understand how much of your observations are coming from the glass, from your ability to interpret, to understand, to draw causal inferences, and to argue for your observations, and not only to repeat things that you may have heard from others. Certainly the best exercise to prepare for the exam is to create a blind tasting of your own. The council offers the tasting exam sheet for use in rehearsal, and you can have someone pour whiskeys for you blind to practice as much as you like before the exam. I recommend studying to using a flavor or aroma wheel and perhaps a list of common aromas in whiskey that will help you to draw out and give words to the things you're experiencing. Another critical bit of advice: don't just taste whiskeys that are interesting to you, taste whiskeys that are important. The core range bottlings of the distilleries that are given to you on the list of possible distilleries featured in the exam are selected for a reason. Many Scotch lovers, whiskey lovers generally, will choose rare and exotic bottlings, old casks, special finishes, things that are interesting for someone who's been around the block. But in the exam like this, we want to see that you have a familiarity with the most likely whiskeys to appear out in the wild. Each of these distilleries offers important high-quality whiskeys, and they're all worth knowing. As you're choosing whiskeys for your tastings, don't choose the oldest age classification. Don't choose bottlings that are limited release or only available at travel retail. These producers have a core range of whiskeys that are more likely to appear on this exam. Look for middle-of-the-road age statements, maybe 12-year-old to 16-year-old, possibly 18-year-old if that's an important bottling from that producer. But remember that you're looking for a comprehensive overview of the most important whiskeys in the world, not necessarily those whiskeys that are going to be most interesting to an advanced consumer. A word about vocabulary as well. Having a clear and consistent vocabulary for the things that you're tasting and smelling, and learning to develop it over time through systematic experience, tasting, thoughtful note-taking, and conversation with others will help you to remember what you're experiencing and bring it to bear on future experience, not only in the exam, but in enjoying and appreciating whiskey. There's no orthodoxy or common set of descriptors that you're required to use in this exam. The standard here is effective communication. Can you bring the judges and others to understand what you're talking about? Are you consistent in describing the same thing between one whiskey and another? Are you articulate? Are you able to present the beverage, to represent it to newcomers, and to help them enjoy their experiences? In the exam format, candidates have just 30 minutes to assess 8 different whiskey samples and to make as many notes as they can about them, which they'll take into a 1.5-hour discussion with a panel of judges. Initially, the judges also taste blind and make their own tasting notes, which they can use to calibrate their examination of each candidate. When you go into the blind tasting, you'll be asked to describe a number of key categories of characteristics of the whiskey as you're experiencing them. One is the dominant and distinctive tasting notes, covering the main flavor categories. Another is the possible age. Another is the perceived alcohol by volume. The next is the extent of peat use. Another asks you to comment on any possible production methods you may be detecting. Another is any comments you may have about the maturation method. The next is any regional style, if it applies. The quality and the complexity of the whiskey in your estimate. And the last, given what you've already said, who you think the producer might be. For this video, I have assembled a selection of 8 different whiskies which have appeared in the past on Master of Scotch exams. And before we get to tasting them, I want to say a few things about what to look for as for the appearance, the nose, the palate, and the finish in a blind tasting context. The appearance alone can provide significant information about the whiskey: the depth, the clarity, the viscosity, how it moves in the glass, whether it leaves legs or tears, and whether they're thick or watery. You may know too that different oak species used to make the cask for maturation or for finishing can produce different colors that you would find in the whiskey. American oak, Quercus alba, is known to produce golden or straw colors, whereas European oak is known to produce reddish or amber colors. This can be confounded by the fact that in Scotch whiskey production it is permissible to use spirit caramel to adjust the coloring of the whiskey before bottling, but this is something that many producers say they do not do, and something that may be a clue in deciding what you think it is. If you have something that's neither gold nor quite fully amber, and you have something somewhat in the middle, then you likely have a whiskey that is, as most Scotch whiskies, a vatting of different casks. Most producers don't make exclusive use of all ex-bourbon American oak casks or all European oak sherry casks. Many will use American oak sherry casks, or they'll use 60% American oak and 40% European oak derived casks. This can all be very confusing, and for that reason I don't rely on it too much. But one thing to note about color is that you may, with experience, begin to remember the exact colors of important bottlings from each producer, or at least remember how those bottlings differ in their color across the core range. This can be very important for deductively analyzing. Once you've seen that a sample is exhibiting a certain distillery character that you find familiar, that sort of family resemblance across the different whiskeys in that range, you may then be able to rely on color as an indicator, knowing something about either the maturation process or simply by being able to reference your own experience of knowing which color corresponds to that whiskey. The two broadest camps to classify whiskeys into on the nose and on the palate, of course, will be the smoky and peated versus unpeated whiskeys. This is something to look for early because it will affect your ability to taste any non-peated whiskeys tasted after peated whiskeys. I always recommend getting that sequence right. The other things to look for, of course, though, broad categories, and these are categories that you'll want to sort of burn into your mind, are fruity, floral, malty, woody, nutty, and less common aromas and flavors possibly associated with faults, pungent flavors, earthy flavors, sulfury flavors. If you can very specifically identify what you're tasting, of course note that down, but think in these categories as well, because they're often indicators of the type of whiskey. You may get different tasting notes and different tasting sessions from the same whiskey, but you may find that it has a characteristic dried fruit flavor or a characteristic dry grassy flavor, even if the specific fruits or the specific type of grass isn't always the same. And of course, don't neglect the tactile, physical, textural qualities of a whiskey, not only on the palate, but on the nose. Some whiskeys are nose drying, some are nose warming, some of them smell sweet. On the palate, check for the viscosity, the weight, how quickly or easily the whiskey moves around in the mouth, whether it coats the palate, whether there's an oiliness that causes the aromas and flavors to linger, whether there's anything astringent or tannic or mineral, how the alcohol is carried. You can have a high alcohol whiskey that nonetheless doesn't drink particularly warmly, or you can have one that's relatively low alcohol but which comes across as tasting of ethanol, which can be sweet or bitter to different palates, but which is generally considered a sign of low quality. Assess your opinion of the quality of the whiskey as well. This is an important factor in identification. If you've had a whiskey 50 times and you thought in your own rating system that it deserved a 93, a 94, and then you're having it has all the tasting notes, it has all of the fruits, the florals, the malty, the earthy, whatever you're expecting, but it doesn't strike you as being of the right level of quality. It's an 89 in your personal scoring system. That's an indicator, and it's something to consider when trying to identify the whiskey. As you study the core ranges of each of the possible distilleries that may appear on your exam, it's certainly worth memorizing which different bottles have which different alcohol by volume at bottling. The alcohol by volume of a given sample may begin to present itself already on the appearance, with slow-moving viscosity, which is often associated with higher alcohol, which may translate into thick or heavy tears or legs or even sheets coating the edge of the glass, which take a while to dissipate. However, alcohol will be most detectable on the palate and on the finish of the whiskey. The alcohol by volume of a given sample of whiskey doesn't only present itself with the alcoholic warmth. Alcohol actually tends to concentrate and to amplify and to make powerful the flavors that it carries, much better than water. If you have a whiskey that you suspect is of higher alcoholic strength, you should not only be able to detect that alcohol directly, but you should notice a somewhat corresponding intensity of flavor. The subject of water in a tasting and the use of water to either open up the aromatic expression of a whiskey or to dilute it in the case of taking off an alcoholic prickle and making it a bit easier to detect and to appreciate the flavors. This is a controversial topic. It's something that in the context of a blind tasting, though, I think there's a fairly clear procedure and a recommendation. I like to use a couple of drops of water to, at most, disrupt the chemical structure of the liquid in the glass and to make some of the aromas more available, but I'm careful not to add so much as to dilute the whiskey. In a blind tasting, it's important to be able to revisit, to compare, to contrast, to go back and forth between different samples. If you think this one's 43% alcohol and you think this one's 50% alcohol, then the one you think is 46 ought to stand somewhere in between the two in terms of your ability to detect the alcohol. And if you've diluted the whiskey early in the session, then unfortunately you won't be able to go back and to revisit that initial impression. The concept of regionality in whiskey is a somewhat controversial topic. There is something useful to thinking about place beyond the specific distillery, but actually the whiskey producing region when thinking through the possibilities of the whiskey that you have on hand. Certainly a peated whiskey, more likely than not, is going to be from Islay or from one of the coastal or island producing areas. Something that has a characteristic fruity sweetness, by probability, you should begin perhaps thinking if it could be a Speyside whiskey. And if it exhibits a dry, malty, or heathery characteristic, you may ask yourself whether it could come from the Highlands. Likewise, a lowland whiskey tends to be a bit lighter, a bit more grassy, a bit more floral, often malty. But given the changes to lowland whiskies over the years, there is quite a diversity of style in the region, so I wouldn't count too much on regionality in thinking about this. This ties into another controversial topic in whiskey, which is whether salt can actually make its way into a whiskey. There are many whiskeys which characteristically give people the sensation of saline or saltiness or brininess or sea spray. You'll hear it described many different ways. Regardless of the question of chemistry and physics, is it possible to make its way through the casks or perhaps through the water in the distillation process? There are many theories about this. Nonetheless, these are typical expressions of certain styles and things that can be used to identify the whiskies. So we'll talk and think a lot about production methods as we go through and the causality of production, and it's good to be conversant in these topics and to be able to explain your observations in terms of them and to be able to use them as tools and as clues to deductively identify as close as you can to the right whiskey. In some cases, you'll know more about why a whiskey may taste the way it does from production and maturation decisions, and some things may be unclear because they come from multiple possible causes or because there's simply not enough known about that to this point. But the solution to that is memorization, experience. There's no replacement for experience in tasting, and certainly if you learn to taste the salt in an old Pulteney or that brininess that you might have in a good Bruichladdich or from a Talisker, then it's something that you'll be able to recognize whether or not you can fully explain and defend a position as to how it got there. Something I recommend to those studying for the exam as well is to compile your own lists of information, key information about distilleries and about their different bottlings. Don't rely just on discrete memories of specific drams. to come to a database of information. You should actually represent and create that database of information in something like a spreadsheet, where perhaps you take down as much information as you possibly can about how the whiskeys are produced and the key characteristics they have. I recommend keeping tasting notes, but not a huge long laundry list of tasting notes that will be confusing and impossible to remember. Try to boil a given distillery down to 2, 3, 4 at most tasting notes that you think are a commonality throughout its core range and which will help you to lead you in that direction. Likewise, for a given bottling, for an important bottling that you want to make sure you remember, take tasting notes, but boil them down to a few essentials. If you find that lime in the Ardbeg, if you find that heather or honey in the Dalwhinnie, or the campfire and the black tea in the Lagavulin. These are snappy, easy to remember taglines that you can place on each of the whiskies in your own mind and which you can train yourself to use as broad brush or rule of thumb identifications. If you are going to consult the distillery's own tasting notes or the opinions of different experts, be sure you get a wide variety of opinions. Read about the exact same bottling in 10 different books and come to distill the specific tasting notes that you find and that you think are essential to remembering the important characteristics of that bottling. The whiskey in your glass is the product of a long series of choices made by the people who produced the whiskey, and many of these choices leave clues, which are the building blocks you'll use to attempt to identify the whiskey, or at least to describe it accurately. If you understand the production processes thoroughly, and you know how each step and each decision that a distillery can make might affect the final flavor of the product, then knowing something about those choices for a given distillery can help you to narrow down what it is that you're tasting, even if it's something you haven't had before. The choice of malt, whether peated or unpeated and how heavily peated, is an important decision that's upstream of everything else in the flavor profile of the whiskey. Some distilleries choose to malt a portion of their own barley, usually between 20 and 40%, in-house. This may be done for traditional reasons or because distilleries have experimented with going entirely to sourced malt from commercial maltsters and found that it adversely affected the flavor of their whiskey. The distinctive character of the malt they produce in-house, they find contributes to a distinctive character in the final product. Once the barley has been ground into grist, mashing is the process of using successive rounds of hot water to extract the starches, which can be converted by the enzymes in the barley into soluble sugars, which are fermentable. The equipment and the manner of mashing can result in a cloudier wort with lots of particulate matter, or a clear wort with very little particulate matter. A cloudy wort generally leads to a maltier, cereal flavor in the whiskey, and a clear wort usually produces something more likely to be fruity and floral. In recent years, the possible importance of different yeast strains has come into focus in the Scotch whisky industry, long having been an important part of the bourbon and Japanese whisky industries. However, experimentation and inquiry into the effects of different yeast strains is still in its relative infancy, and most distilleries draw from a small number of traditional strains. But this isn't a significant differentiator at this point, and therefore not something I would focus on much as you study for this exam. The most important thing in fermentation to consider really is the fermentation length. Typically, the shortest fermentation time you'll find cited is 48 hours, and the longest you'll find is well over 100 hours. The longer the fermentation time, all of the things being equal, the more likely you are to have a fruity, estuary whiskey. At the same time, a very long fermentation time, despite its benefits, can lead to certain faults. After the yeast have done their work of converting the soluble sugars into alcohol, carbon dioxide, and flavorful byproducts, they go into a dormant phase, which may allow bacteria and other microorganisms to grow, creating some desirable flavors, but in some cases producing flaws in what will become the wash for distillation. Once our wort has been converted by fermentation into a wash for distillation, it's pumped through a heat exchanger and becomes the charge of our wash still. It's at this stage that we need to focus much more on the equipment and the process of a given distillery to understand its characteristic style. The shape and the size of the still, and any features such as a boiler ball or a lamp glass shape with a cinched middle, may result in reflux, which is vapor condensing on the sides of the still and running back into the wash for redistillation, producing a lighter spirit characteristically. How the height and shapes of the still affect the collection of different aromatics at different boiling points has an effect on the final distillate. The shape of the head of the still and whether perhaps the distiller has chosen to add a cooling jacket to increase reflux. The angle of the line arm, whether ascending, descending, or horizontal, and whether it has a purifier attached to it to increase reflux. If above the neck you have an ascending line arm, it's much easier for reflux to make its way back into the still. If you have a descending line arm, it's much easier for anything that condenses in the line arm to make its way forward into the condenser. After the distillate is run off a still, the most important consideration now for the flavor characteristics of a whiskey as production methods influence them is the condensation method. Traditional worm tub condensers have largely been replaced in the whiskey industry, but many distilleries still use them and achieve an effect on the spirit through them. A worm tub condenser is a copper coil making its way through typically a cold vat of water. This cooling causes any vapor present and moving through the coil to condense quickly back into liquid, with relatively little time in contact with copper. Conversely, the modern shell and tube condenser, which, as it sounds, is a shell filled with many copper tubes through which cold water runs, has much more copper contact before the vapor actually converts into liquid. This results in much more removal of sulfurous compounds and produces generally, just as in distillation, a much lighter spirit through contact with copper. Approximately 1/3 of Diageo-owned properties, which are considerable, and 4 out of 5 Inverhouse distilleries still use worm tub condensers. The next critical juncture in production takes place in the spirit safe, where the distiller has the option to remove parts of the distillation run as part of the heads or the foreshots at the beginning of distillation, include them in the heart cut, which is the spirit that's going to be collected and put into cask, or remove the tails of the distillation, or the feints, which contain unpleasant aromas that would spoil the spirit if it were included. The distiller has quite a bit of leeway in deciding where exactly to make these cut points, and this is something that contributes heavily to the distinctive character of the spirit from a particular distillery. The next flavor impacting decision the distiller makes is the proof at which the new make spirit is filled into casks. Some producers fill casks at the natural strength at which the spirit is collected, and others proof the spirit down with water to a given point, typically 63.5% alcohol, before filling it into the cask. The reason this decision makes a difference is that different chemical compounds in the wood of a cask can contribute different flavors to a whiskey, some of which are water soluble and others are alcohol soluble. So the relative quantity of alcohol to water, that ratio of alcohol to water, may cause different flavors to be drawn out of the cask as the spirit matures. One of the main reasons oak is used as the wood to produce casks in which spirits will mature is that it characteristically keeps liquids in while allowing oxygen to steadily come into the cask and influence the spirit. The relative levels of alcohol and water also have an impact on how oxygen is absorbed and how it influences the development of flavors. The main species of oak used to produce casks for spirit maturation are Quercus alba, American white oak, and Quercus robur or Quercus petrea, 2 types of European oak. These different oak species contribute different colors, flavors, and textures to a whiskey, and these may offer telltale signs in a blind tasting. And depending on the number of times the cask has been refilled, it will be more or less active, contributing its flavors to the new spirit. And if it held sherry or port or a dessert wine or a red wine, for example, it may contribute some of the color and flavors of the previous contents. American oak, by the way, is not only used to produce the bourbon barrels that are common throughout the whiskey industry, it's also used predominantly today to produce sherry barrels. So the discussion of American versus European oak and ex-bourbon, ex-sherry can sometimes become a bit confusing. Conversely, though, European oak is never made to produce bourbon barrels, and so you can count on ex-bourbon casks being Quercus alba, American oak. Once a spirit has reached a level of maturity, it may be re-racked into another cask for a second maturation or a cask finish, and this is critical to the character of the spirit and is something that should be remembered. If a distillery has cask finished or double matured whiskies in its range, they're certainly useful to taste and to remember and to compare against whiskies which have only gone through the traditional maturation process from the same distillery. The last decision made at the distillery which will affect what's in your glass is of course the bottling proof, the alcohol by volume in the final product. Now we've covered a huge amount of detail here, and this is not meant to imply that you need to know every last one of these details about each distillery and each bottling that can appear on the exam. This is really meant to help you with the kind of thinking that may be helpful in a deductive fashion to figure out what it is that's in the glass, or to decide between two things that you find to be similar, but which may feature some things that point in the direction of a particular production process, or may help you to differentiate something within the range of a distillery by characteristic features of a particular bottling. Some of these details may also help you to demonstrate knowledge to your judges and to explain, to give justification to the choices that you made in identifying the whiskey. If you haven't gotten the whiskey exactly nailed, you may nonetheless have a very good reason for thinking what you did, and that's all something that's going to be considered when deciding whether you've passed the exam. Part of studying for this exam is making sure that you know the key characteristics of each of the distilleries themselves, the distillery character, what is the kind of through line that can be expected for any of the bottlings of these distilleries, but also within the core range of each of those distilleries, what would help you to differentiate one whiskey from another. And as we taste through these whiskeys in this lineup, we'll talk about the telltale signs, not only of the distillery, but also of the particular bottling on hand. So what do we know about Auchentoshan? We know that it is a lowland distillery, and the only remaining lowland distillery that exclusively uses the traditional triple distillation method, which was common in the 19th century among lowland distilleries, possibly due to the influence of Irish whiskey in the region and Irish immigration there. But we know that that leads to a relatively light spirit, possibly something a bit grassy, a bit citrusy, maybe floral, and that's a starting point. You know, if we're looking at the overall impression on the nose, on the palate, this is certainly a direction to go in. And we know about this particular bottling that it is made in American oak only, and if we've done our research, we know it's 100% first fill American oak ex-bourbon casks. And so in that case, we should expect certain aromas and flavors that are unique to American oak, things like coconut, vanilla, and that I say unique, but they're in very small proportions from European oak, and we can expect the absence of the typical dried fruit, the reddish amber color, the tannin content that may be a little bit astringent on the palate. Those things we would expect to be absent from this particular bottling. We know also that Auchentoshan characteristically in that triple distillation process uses the heads from the intermediate still in the spirit still, and that this is going to lead to some pretty high-toned aromas and flavors. So things that in too great a concentration can actually be considered a flaw in a whiskey. Those acetone, ethereal, estery kinds of flavors that may even come off a bit pungent, but that's part of the characteristic flavor profile in the way it's moderated here in Auchentoshan. So we know that we might be looking for something like that little touch of furniture polish, that little touch of a varnishy sort of flavor, certainly those citrus aromas and flavors. And if it's an older Auchentoshan, maybe something like hazelnut or a certain nutty maltiness. There's a bit of a maltiness as well on the younger bottlings, but here really the thing that differentiates it from the others is that this is all American oak. And that's something that once you've zoomed in on Auchentoshan based on that kind of those high-toned aromas that you may associate with kind of high cut points when they've let many more of the esters that would normally have gone to be removed from the whiskey with the foreshots, they've let that into the hard cut, into the spirit. Once we've identified that, we can then start to break down what are the possible bottlings, and with the American oak in this case and the absence of those other flavors, have a good chance of identifying this. Now my immediate impression of this Old Pulteney, of course, is the amber color. This tells me that it's likely not only American oak. The next thing, I can confirm that on the palate. I certainly have dried fruits that I associate with European oak ex-sherry casks, which are operative in bottling. And I have that seaside ocean spray, briny, maritime, however you describe it, sort of aroma that is characteristic of this. Something I often get from Old Pulteney as well, behind, in this case, that sherry dried fruit aroma, is the freshness, the fresh fruit. I often get kind of tropical fruits and even a sweetness that's reminiscent of butterscotch. That's typical for this producer. And I certainly get that salty, mineral, saline impression, very lively on the palate and nearly savory. What do we know about the GlenDronach that might help us to identify it in a blind tasting? For one thing, we know that the producer uses only European ex-sherry casks. This is true for the 12, for the 15, for the 18, and for the 21. I think we know too that in this tasting lineup, given that there's an emphasis on distillery character and bottles that are attainable and widespread, that we could probably exclude the 21 as something that would be in the exam. You can't always know that that's the case, but if you're thinking in probabilities, I would suspect the 12, 15, and 18 are on the table and that the 21 isn't. Between those bottlings, we also know that the GlenDronach 12 is 43% alcohol, and we know that the GlenDronach 15 is 46% alcohol, likewise the 18. And so here we're looking at the difference of that additional time in the cask, that influence of maturation, to differentiate these. And that could be quite difficult. The 15 and the 18 can taste similar, and I would say that either is a fair guess. This is why there's not such an emphasis in nailing the exact bottle, but actually making observations that are consistent with the actual whiskey in your glass. And so many of the same observations for the 15 would be the observations that you have for the 18, and I wouldn't sweat too much narrowing it down from there. We do know that as of 2021, the GlenDronach is non-chill filtered. We know that it is natural color, so they're not coloring it, and so anything we learn from looking at the whiskey in the glass, if we suspect that it is this, is going to be true to what the oak influence has done. So this color is a perfect example of a deep amber color that is indicative of ex-sherry, but made with a European cask. We don't know right away that that's what it is until we get to the nose and can confirm that those are the aromas we would expect from a European ex-sherry cask, like dried fruit, for example, and a certain spiciness, spices, baking spices, but also woody spices. And once we get to that point with this particular whiskey, I think it's just utterly characteristic. I have nothing but this heavy dried apricot, sultanas, raisins on the fruit profile, and I also have the impression of an intensity that makes me think I may have something on the higher end of the alcohol spectrum. 46% is well above the 40% minimum and what we might see from some of these other whiskeys. We also certainly have that characteristic woody, spicy aroma, and I get more of those woody flavors typically from a GlenDronach than I do from other ex-sherried European oak cask whiskies. It's typical of the house. I find that you can in many places get some of those softer baking spices, and it's really just a matter of experience to see which producer is pulling out which of the possible aromas and greater concentration in their particular bottlings. GlenDronach, to me, along with a very small number of other producers, really have that intense expression of woody flavors in Scotch that are things that, having a foot in other whiskey worlds, other places around the world, might give you to compare it to something like a bourbon. A bourbon often has that spicy, woody character, and from a Scotch, that's certainly a big indicator that this may be what you have. Now, what does the Glenfarclas 105 cask strength have to offer us by way of clues as to its identity in a blind tasting? Certainly the cask strength aspect is going to be the leading indicator. The 105 was a pioneer in cask strength whiskies, being released in the 60s and has been made ever since at 60% alcohol exactly. This is not something that is proofed. They actually accomplish a consistent 60% alcohol by vatting different cask strength, different casks, and then bottling them at strength. But they select the casks in a way that the alcohol by volume adds up to exactly 60% before bottling. The indication of a cask strength begins sometimes on the appearance. You'll notice a certain viscosity and a heaviness. You can see before doing anything else that the alcohol separation from the water in the whiskey is quite different from that of lesser alcohol by volume whiskeys. You'll see that it sort of lingers, it sticks, it forms sheets in the glass, and then they sort of break with these little spots or points, and only after a few seconds start to rain down as tears or legs, and then do so in a rather thick, slow, viscous way. So already we think we're dealing with something that could be higher alcohol, it could be finished. Sometimes you have a port finish or a dessert wine finish that can lend that thickness, that viscosity. You can also have whiskeys simply by virtue of how they were distilled that were viscous. So we have to go further to know what we're dealing with. But on the nose immediately, with this whiskey, I get a characteristic sultana, white raisin kind of aroma. Certainly lots of dried fruit. Glenfarclas is made using only ex-sherry casks. They don't say only European ex-sherry. Could be American and European, and likely so. This isn't an incredibly dark or red amber color. I have that sherry-like aroma. You almost even get the aroma of a dessert wine. It reminds me a bit of Pedro Jimenez dessert wines, but in a very diffuse and light way. It doesn't come across as having been finished in such a cask. But that sherry aroma, that winey character, as well as the dried fruits and the spices that you expect. In this case, we're not dealing with those heavy woody spices that I have on the GlenDronach. We have many of those softer baking spices like cinnamon, clove. I even get a bit of nutmeg, for example, and a certain nuttiness. Generally, you could have walnuts, almond, you can have hazelnut, you can have kind of warm chestnuts. These are all things that might lead me in the direction of this particular producer, just having experienced so many of their whiskeys. On the palate, you definitely begin to, certainly you can confirm that higher alcohol, the cask strength, but it is drinkable. Some cask strength whiskeys are really best diluted with water by the consumer before being drunk, but the Glenfarclas 105 is famously something that many people find they're able to enjoy as it is, neat. We also know that Glenfarclas is one of the last holdouts in the Scotch industry that is still direct firing their pot stills. Direct firing, meaning fire directly under the still using gas, is going to produce a great deal of heat right along the copper of the still, which can cause a sort of Maillard reaction, which is akin to caramelization, but it involves proteins and sugars, and can actually create a sort of a nice toasted or even burnt aroma. It creates this kind of savory flavor, and you certainly detect it in spades in the Glenfarclas 105. It's something that really carries through the distillery character for all of the bottlings of this producer. Now, before we go on to the next whiskeys, you'll notice perhaps that I did put these whiskeys in an order that's favorable for tasting, which means that now we're moving into the introduction of peat into the flavor profile, something that's a little bit difficult to go back from after you've started tasting it. Once you've had a peated whiskey, that flavor tends to linger on the palate, and it becomes difficult to differentiate peated and unpeated. So I did put these into the sequence of sort of light, delicate, and then growing in strength and intensity, and then save the peated whiskies for last. This is not necessarily going to be the sequence in which the whiskies are served in the blind tasting. And so one of the first things that I did and that I recommend everyone do is smell through the full lineup to try to identify which of the whiskies may be peated, so that you can skip them as you go through and come back to them later. Now, to avoid confusion on the table, I don't remove them. I simply push them back a couple of inches, and then I proceed to taste through the other whiskies, which are unpeated or minimally peated, and then go on to those more heavily smoky whiskies that would certainly make it more difficult on the palate. You could do the same thing with the cask strength whiskies. Higher alcohol does also tend to affect the palate fatigue, but this is something that every person will have to have their own strategy. I did that as well. I did try to come next after the first taste through of perhaps the lower alcohol, more delicate whiskies. I then came to the cask strength, and then I went on to the peated whiskies, as I'm doing in this demonstration. Now, moving to the Springbank, the first in this lineup, there are a few things to note about what might give this whiskey away. The first is what won't give it away. This is a whiskey that, like many others, is not made only from American ex-bourbon cask or ex-sherry casks only. You won't get much of a differentiation just by the appearance. This bottling happens to be 60% ex-bourbon and 40% ex-sherry, unclear the degree to which those ex-sherry casks are of American or European oak species. We don't get much from the color alone in this case. We may have some thoughts about the viscosity, the brightness, how it looks in the glass. I don't get a ton of information just from the appearance here, and so we'll move on to the nose and the palate. Now, on the nose, we very quickly get what I think are some good clues as to this, and this is a Springbank branded bottling, meaning it's not one of the other brands put out from the same distillery, such as Longrow or Hazelburn. Longrow is heavily peated, Hazelburn is unpeated, Springbank is lightly peated. So you do have a touch of smoke and peat here. I would say it's more on the smoky side of peat, not the medicinal, fishy, kippery, seaweed, iodine sort of thing that you might get from more of the Islay whiskies. I get a nice smokiness reminiscent of soot and campfire, but I also get another clue on the nose, which has to do with production choices at Springbank. There is an element of that direct firing that we talked about. This is used in some of the stills at Springbank, not all, and it's also something that is a little bit heavier, nearly meaty. We'll see that better on the palate, but this may be something that you can attribute to the use of worm tubs on one of the stills at the distillery. A worm tub condensed whiskey tends to be a bit heavier, meatier, and retains some of its sulfur aromas and flavors. At least on the new make, those tend to blow off with maturation, but can often leave a bit of a savory, meaty character even after long maturation. Another typical tasting note of Springbank and other distilleries, often in Campbeltown, is this pleasant dirtiness. There's a ruggedness, there's an authentic kind of rusticity to this whiskey. It doesn't come across as a highly polished industrial product. This really makes you think of what you would imagine whiskeys tasting like 200 years ago. With that said, there is an incredible flavor complexity and a refined character. You have lots of well-delineated, sort of equally assertive, beautiful, easy to differentiate flavors. I have a slight sweet fruitiness, not overly sweet, a bit citrusy as well. I have a nice floral perfuminess, a grassiness, and a malty character, like certainly a dried barley kind of flavor that comes through. Another thing you might get is a certain mineral quality to to the whiskey. I get that from many coastal, maritime, island Scottish whiskies, Talisker being a good example, but not this impression of the soft water of the Highlands. You get the impression a little bit of water straight from the well. It's got that mineral texture and catch to it. This is one of the whiskies that is simply going to require experience to know this is what a Springbank tastes like. Likewise with the age, it is relatively light. I know that many of the bottlings of Springbank, particularly the next one up, which might be another candidate, the 12, for example, is a bit darker. The Springbank 15 is a bit darker. The 12 typically is a cask strength. So this alcohol, which is 46% alcohol by volume, is an indicator of what it could be. Certainly not dark enough eye color to be the 15-year-old as we know it. And so in this case, I think it's fairly clear. If you think it's Springbank, you note this color, you note this alcohol content, you're very likely to guess this one correctly. The next whiskey in the lineup is the Talisker Distiller's Edition. And you may know the Distiller's Editions are a special selection of whiskies in the Diageo portfolio, which are produced from what were the classic malts. There were 6 classic malts of Scotland introduced in 1988, really helped to put single malt Scotch whiskey on the map internationally after its sort of slow and steady development through the late 60s and 70s. The classic malts were sort of the iconic distilleries, also some of the first to get visitor centers as quintessential examples of different regions. And Talisker is a distinctive whiskey in its own right, so I think the best chance you have of identifying this one is from the nose and the palate, finding some of those typical and characteristic flavors. But what you have here is something that is going to indicate something to you just by the color. The Distiller's Editions are essentially the base product given a second maturation in a different type of cask. Some of them different varieties of sherry cask, in this case Amoroso sherry, which gives a bit of a sweetness to the impression. But this is a clue at the beginning that we're possibly dealing with something in this neighborhood. Once we get to the aroma, I immediately get, of course this is within the peated section of our tasting here, I have these kind of spicy barbecue smoke notes. Reminds me of barbecue sauce, and that could narrow it down to a few different things. I sometimes get that from Lagavulin, I sometimes get that from other peated whiskies. In this case, I think it's a fairly clear indicator for this one. If you're familiar with the bottling, this should point you directly here and really help you to narrow it down to just a few. Talisker, though, it's going to have that mineral character I mentioned before. Some of that will come through as a pepperiness. There's a certain kind of black pepper, red pepper on the finish in particular. There's definitely that maritime character. Talisker is one of the others, along with Old Pulteney, that if you're detecting a saline, salty quality, it tends to be one of the whiskies in which that's most prominent. And certainly that ruggedness, that dirtiness I mentioned. I brought this whiskey up when I was discussing Campbeltown. This is another one that tastes like that, but quite different really from Campbeltown. So I think you have something here that you have quite a good chance of detecting which it is. It's possible that you wouldn't know which bottling. Certainly any identification of a Talisker is going to be impressive, either in older age, something done in a way that would achieve this color. Difficult given that it's normally done in bourbon casks only, but that should lead you definitely in the direction of age or in a cask finishing. On the palate, certainly the alcoholic strength that we would expect and that we could begin to anticipate from the appearance, the viscosity, the thickness of those sheets, and those slow running tears in the glass, that's all confirmed on the palate. Talisker, among Diageo whiskies, tends to be higher alcohol. Diageo tends to be around 43 for many of their whiskies. Talisker is always 45.8 all the different bottlings come in at 45.8, and nearly 46%. That's a category to think in, you know, thinking 40, thinking 43, thinking 46, and then thinking 50 and above. Placing it in the middle of that spectrum will help you possibly to identify it as a Talisker. And beyond that, certainly just recognition of that distillery character. Talisker is another that uses worm tubs in its production. This is going to give it that richness, that meatiness that you might begin to be able to detect and differentiate the more you have whiskies that were produced using worm tub condensers as against more modern shell and tube condensers. Long, lingering finish. You do have those dried fruits from the sherry. This would help to differentiate it from other Taliskers in the lineup. You're not typically going to get dried fruit in a Talisker simply because most of them don't have any contact with the ex-sherry or European oak. This is something that lingers on the finish, that higher body, that higher viscosity, that alcohol, even that worm tub contribution often is a kind of lingering oiliness on the palate that causes those flavors to stick and to hang around. Certainly that smokiness lingers, and really a beautiful whiskey. I think this is something that, knowing it's a premium bottling, this is something that is one of the more expensive Taliskers before you get into the very high age statements. Just the quality impression, where you might think about the quality in your own opinion, would help you to identify it as well. Now, the ex-sherry casks used to finish this whiskey, to give it a second maturation, are Amoroso sherry seasoned American oak, so Quercus alba casks, which may explain why there's not so much of a redness. This is a deep golden color. Nonetheless, Talisker is among the distilleries that doesn't make reference to whether this is bottled at natural color, and so this is something that, again, we can't always rely too much on what can be detected by color, except in the case that a whiskey is so light in color, pale straw, light golden color, that it seems very difficult to imagine much of a European oak influence. So it's a small clue, doesn't always help you, so try not to get too absorbed into the question of the species of oak. It can be quite confounded by the addition of caramel coloring. Now, Port Charlotte, 10-year-old, heavily peated. Port Charlotte is a whiskey. It's a brand made at the Bruichladdich distillery, and something that I think actually is quite difficult to differentiate from some of the other Islay whiskeys. It does have some key characteristics that would give you a clue, but this is a case where the emphasis on identifying the exact thing may be subordinated to giving a clear, precise, competent description of the whiskey in the glass as the judges see it. The appearance is quite light. In color, there is a kind of a gold straw color. This is something that is true of many Islay whiskies that you could possibly confuse it with. For example, the Ardbeg 10-year-old is quite light in the same way. Very similar hue, kind of lemon highlights. Not much to tell from that. You could look at the alcohol content. This does seem to be higher. You notice these lingering, very, very slow-moving legs. Doesn't look to be cask strength. It's not the viscosity. It moves rather easily in the glass, but we'll have to go on to the nose and to the palate to understand what we think of that. The nose right away to me gives of course the smoky aromas. That's to be expected. Once we've gone through the tasting and seen that it's peated, we'll of course note that it's smoky. What kind of smoke? That's something to consider. If you had something that were a bit more medicinal, more seaweed, more kippery, that might be something you would think could be a Laphroaig, something that tends to have that aroma. This is definitely more in the campfire, bonfire, sooty, ashy sort of aroma camp. So to me, this helps to think in that category, to put it in a little bit of a narrowed down range, but I still want to continue before I know for sure, because smoke can be a little bit difficult to diagnose. You can have some of those aromas and flavors coming out with time and oxygen in a way that you didn't notice them at first. Certainly on the fruit side, you have a very nice lemony, citrusy flavor. There are a few different whiskeys that might give you this. Again, the Ardbeg. This is one that you might confuse it with if you're in a blind tasting. It's very clean. This is not a muddled or convoluted flavor profile. The aromas are clear, distinct, but it has this brightness, this freshness. I get some barley aromas, I get some nutty aromas. Certainly barley is something that you can expect from a Bruichladdich whiskey. They really emphasize the barley in many of their bottlings. It's sort of the differentiating factor and something that tends to come through from their distillery. The palate really fulfills on an aroma I was getting faintly on the nose, which is a kind of white pepper. And I have a mouth coating, sort of full-bodied texture. It wasn't fully viscous in the glass, but it's something that once it hits the palate, certainly coats it, and it tends to linger. This tells me slightly higher alcohol. You can definitely tell that with the warmth. And this is always the case. Bruichladdich and Port Charlotte tend to be 50% alcohol exactly. And this is definitely registering in that area. So clearly not 40, 43. You could think maybe 46. And so with the combination of this nose, this palate, this viscosity, and this alcohol by volume, you have a good chance of identifying this. If you did call it an Ardbeg 10, something like that, I think you would be close enough in the neighborhood of having described it correctly. So again, this is a case of many whiskeys having quite overlapping features that the judges likely would not penalize a confusion between the two. One of the things that's typical of many peated whiskeys is a core of sweetness on the palate, particularly Islay peated whiskeys, that tends to balance out other primary flavors that come from smoke that might be a bit more bitter. This is something that can come from the distillation process itself, the choice to select more of those estery, sweet fruit flavors, but you can also get it from the influence of wood. Something I notice on this one, which is a note that it doesn't have, sometimes the notes it doesn't have are just as important as the ones that it does, is any sweetness that I can detect that's contributed by the oak. So the oak maturation here doesn't seem to have lent any kind of a caramel, butterscotch, toffee, anything like that. So to me, this speaks to less active oak casks. They seem to be primarily American oak, if not entirely American oak, but I don't have a ton of the oak lactones, that coconut. I don't have a ton of vanilla, and so to me this may be a clue, depending on what you know about this bottling. Now, Ardbeg Wee Beastie, certainly a distillery that comes with a distinctive character, with a characteristic set of aromas and flavors. Certainly that citrus that many people find maybe in the lime direction is something that you can look out for if you suspect you may have an Ardbeg. The complexity is something that I know Ardbeg for. It's over and above other Islay single malts that may have similar flavor profiles. Certainly something that comes across as kind of layered and dimensional and just sort of well organized on the palate. It has a wide variety of different aromas and flavors. If we don't know what we're looking at this point, it could be quite difficult to tell by the color, although I think from this color we do know we can likely exclude the Ardbeg 10-year-old, which is much lighter. This does have that amber color that implies what is true in this case, that there is some possible influence from European ex-sherry casks. Not entirely. This also is matured in bourbon, ex-bourbon casks as well. That's a vatting of the two types. You again have some of those barbecue-like smoky aromas, which is a sort of tightly interwoven connection between this sweet smoke and those kind of cayenne aromas and flavors. That pepperiness, again, kind of a white pepper, something that I found on the Port Charlotte and that may cause some confusion in a blind tasting, in which I, again, think this makes it something that's okay to confuse for that. Although, again, we do have that color difference. Very important to know the colors of the different bottlings to be able to differentiate in some cases. You have a sweetness in the peat of an Ardbeg that you can often find. It's not just this sooty, ashy flavor. Those flavors are there, but there is that sweet kind of seaweed. It's not medicinal. It's a kind of a sweet, very maritime, coastal flavor. The alcohol is certainly a factor here. 47.4% for the Wee Beastie puts it in the higher end of the alcohol range, although that doesn't help you fully in differentiating it among the Ardbegs, except to exclude certain bottlings which are in the high 50s, which are not technically cask strength. Those are proofed, but things like the Ugadal and the Court of Reckon are in the high 50s, so you can eliminate those, and those are some of the others that may have that darker color. So again, you can use that to sort of triangulate what you think this is. This is a 5-year aged whiskey, so if you've developed your palate to the point that you can differentiate the influence of age, some of those mature flavors that you get that you don't necessarily get on a younger bottling. Of course, this can include older whiskey, but given that we don't have an oversupply of very old whiskey, and we know that in the case of Ardbeg, the Wee Beastie is likely to contain whiskey that, if not all, the vast majority of which is 5 years old. That can give you a clue. The name Wee Beastie, that intensity, that power, this is something to notice here and to differentiate it from some of the other things that you might think it tastes like. It's mouth-filling, it's rich, it doesn't linger forever on the palate. You do have this dissipation. It's not totally mouth-coating, but there is a heaviness to it, and it's something that allows it to have a fairly long finish. Certainly excellent on a fairly young, one of the youngest age statement whiskeys available, certainly in this quality category. So thinking through all of these factors may lead you in the direction of the Wee Beastie, but again, one that has a lot of overlap with other whiskeys and where you may get some leeway if you don't nail it exactly. If you're planning to take a master exam and are preparing for the blind tasting component, I hope this video has been helpful, has given you some guidance as to the thinking, the level of detail, and I hope you've learned something about the production process, perhaps, and learned a few things that you may want to dig into further. For that, certainly get a copy of each of the required readings, and please don't hesitate to contact us if you'd like to be pointed toward more resources, or have any questions, or would like a one-on-one discussion about your progress as you study for the exam. For those not yet planning to take an exam, I hope this dive into the topic of blind tasting has been useful for you in your enjoyment of whiskey, and that it may encourage you to join us at the Council of Whiskey Masters someday. Cheers.